Hello?
Telephone.
I'll call you right back. Call you right back.
Telephone.
I'll Call You Right Back podcast.
What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of I'll Call You Right Back podcast with me, your host. My name's Chad Medved. Very nice to meet you. Welcome to all the new people. Welcome back to all the returning listeners. If you could take a second, scroll down on your podcast, hit subscribe, and leave me a rate and review on the podcast if you would be so kind. This is all for free. And I just ask you of one thing. This will take you 2 minutes. Subscribe and rate and review the podcast. 5 stars if you would be so kind. If you got nothing nice to say, just don't say it. There's no reason to say it. If you're going to badmouth me, I'm working hard over here. So please be nice. But yeah, 5 stars. Give me a rate and review. It helps me out a lot. Happy birthday to Turner Dairy Farms for turning 90 this year. They have a brand new limited edition milk out. It is a birthday cake flavored milk that is blue. So if you go to your local store that carries Turner's products, look to see if they have the blue milk in their cooler. If they don't, ask them for it and see if they can get some ordered in for you. But if you want to find it immediately, go on Turner's website at turnerdairy.net and type in your address, and it will populate all the stores that carries Turner's products, and you look at the bottom of them and it'll tell you if they carry the limited edition flavors. I wanted to say thank you to Turner Dairy Farms for, sponsoring the podcast. I'll Call You Right Back is fueled by Turner's, and we're proud of it. And I'm excited to keep the Jeep riding with them guys. Another thing that I wanted to let everyone know is Streets on Carson, one of the best places in the world, is doing something special for this week. So first thing is first, if you want to order a takeout, if you want to order from Streets, you could order takeout. Call them in, put an order in, and you can just pick it up. They got great food available, street foods from around the world. It is a limited menu because of the virus, but, they're still open for business except for Mondays. Mondays are personal days. But this Sunday, they are doing something special. They are doing family dinner. So family dinner is, so there's a few rules. There's no substitutions or special instructions. It's just the menu is what it is. You could hit them up with a DM or give them a phone call and let them know how many people you want to order for. It will be $10 a plate, and all orders must be in by 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. No orders after, so please don't ask. But you have like 24 hours, more than that, to get in your order. So give them a call and DM them if you are interested. The menu is going to be stuffed pork loins with apples, pancetta, aged white cheddar, sweet and sour braised red cabbage, whipped potatoes, and caramelized leek sauce, which is, I don't know what half that is, but it all sounds unreal. But you pick it up at 6 o'clock on Sunday, and you'll have a to-go box ready, and then we could all go to our designated quarantine spaces, and we can enjoy the same meal together on some level of, family. That's some level of family. We're all eating the same thing. We're all enjoying the same thing, breaking bread together. But I wanted to talk about a few things that I've been watching. So, to take up my time with this quarantine, I've just been trying to do some different shit. I've been watching a bunch of shit. I've just been watching all kinds. I've been watching old movies, new movies, and it's cool. It's cool. I'm getting tired of it. I'm getting tired of watching Netflix. I'm getting tired of watching Hulu. It's just, if you can only watch so much TV. I have been enjoying myself. I've been on YouTube watching a show called Kenny vs. Spenny. If you do not know what that is, it is a show from Canada. It's these two guys that run, I don't know if you would call it a game show, but it's a show full of competitions. So it's these two guys, Kenny Hotz and Spencer Rice, and what they do is they basically just hold a competition every episode. Some of the examples are, who could eat the most meat, who could be tied to a goat the longest, who could be blindfolded the longest, who could smoke the most weed, who could be the better parent, who could be in a haunted house longer. And let me just tell you that the show is hilarious. And all of these are available on YouTube. We've been ripping through them, me and my wife. If you type in Kenny versus Spenny, Spenny, they will pop up, and just pick one and just go down the rabbit hole, because I'm sure not a lot of people have listened to it. Another thing that I've been getting pretty deep into, I have been watching an insane amount of videos on making bread, on cooking, on baking. And I recently started my newest venture, which is a sourdough starter. It's currently 3 days old. The little guy's growing big and strong, and I'm pumped about it. Basically, a sourdough starter is some natural yeast that you cultivate and you use to create sourdough bread. And, if you don't understand what yeast is the stuff that makes the bread airy and like fluffy, and, kind of gives you them pockets of air in there. And I'm excited to bake. We're stuck at home every single day, and I'm not someone that's, I'm not eating out too much. I'm definitely going to grab that Streets on Carson Sunday meal, but I haven't been eating out too much because I've been using this time to, kind of make my own shit in the kitchen. I whipped up some pork dumplings the other day. I whipped up some scones the other day. I whipped up, I've just been in there getting it. And I think a lot of it has to do with me watching all these cooking shows. Like, I've been deep diving into Bon Appetit's YouTube channel. I've talked about it on here for probably the last 3 or 4 weeks. It's basically just a YouTube channel of these people that are cooking dope shit, and they make it very, very easy to... They make it easy. They make it, they step everything out for you. They make it fun to watch, and I enjoy it. So I'm excited to start whipping out loaves of bread. You already know that. But for people that do not know, this podcast is normally a podcast where I speak with people about what they do and how they got to that point in life. But due to the coronavirus and its, hindrance maybe, I am... doing research-based podcasts. So what I'll do is I'll get a topic from a listener or a couple topics, and then I will do a poll on my Instagram. If you're not following me, please take a second I'll call you right back. I do polls all the time. You could be involved in what I talk about next week, and you kind of just participate in some of the feedback that I'm looking for. Last week I talked about pyramid schemes. I got so many great reviews on the pyramid scheme episode. People fucking loved it. And what's not to love? I mean, pyramid schemes are crazy, and it's a great transition to my topic this week. This week I'm talking about cults. So cults, I mean, maybe you could call it, maybe it's a label, maybe it's a what's the word? Maybe it's another way to describe a pyramid scheme. No, I won't go that deep into it. But cults. So I asked people to throw in some topics to start to research, and cults was one of them. And it stuck into my mind. I kind of have a little bit of an idea about some cults. I read a little bit about them, and I'm excited to talk about it. It's a wild thing to get into, and doing my research, I realized that the word cult not always had a derogatory, meaning that was with it. Before people called things cults, the word cult was used to kind of like talk about different chapters of religions, not chapters, but different groups of religious people. But we could get into basically, I just don't want to get into the history of the word. I want to talk about the cults that everyone is thinking about. The weirdos. Drink the Kool-Aid. Doing all this wild shit, and it's easy to do that. So I started to, deep dive into cults and deep dive into what a cult is, and I kind of wanted to to figure out how I wanted to lay this podcast out so it was a little bit more organized. But I looked up the definition. The modern definition of a cult: a social group that is defined by its unusual religious, spiritual, or philosophical beliefs, or by its common interest in a particular personality, object, or goal. So that is the cult that we're all thinking of. The people that are just worshiping certain things. You got Waco, you got Heaven's Gate, you got Jonestown, you got, all kinds of wild shit. But whenever I think of a cult, I wanted to think what comes to my mind whenever I think of a cult. And, Jonestown Massacre, Heaven's Gate, Charles Manson, and, a couple things like that. Religion, relax. I'm not comparing religion to Heaven's Gate or Jonestown Massacre, but I am, just saying religion pops into my head whenever I hear the word cult. Sorry about it. But not too much else, comes to mind right away. I don't know too much about them. I just know of them. And I can't remember where I heard about Heaven's Gate or Waco or, Jonestown Massacre, but I learned of them somewhere. It might have been from MySpace because MySpace was messed up back in the day. I remember there were, do you remember them videos that people would send around of a terrorist cutting off someone's head or some shit like that? I don't know. My friends, some of them watched some of that shit, and I saw some of them videos whenever I was growing up, and it was just, it was intense. But maybe that's where I heard about it. Maybe, I'm not really positive, but I wanted to get kind of deeper into them. And I feel like for the sake of time and organization, I wanted to touch on two of the main cults that I know of. And one of them is Jonestown Massacre, and one of them is Heaven's Gate. But before we get into that, I wanted to kind of talk about what a cult is. So Googling all this stuff, one of the biggest questions that pop up along with answers are, what is the difference between religion and a cult? And I know that that's a touchy subject, and I know that some people are a little bit more touchy about it than others, but realistically, what is the difference between a religion and a cult? And don't worry, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but that's they're kind of similar. Religion and a cult is kind of similar. But basically what it boils down to is, it seems that cults do not stand the test of time. Christianity and all that stuff, they've been around forever and ever and ever. And some cults, they're so drastic that, they don't last. And that's basically part of, that's a boiled down version of what the difference is. I don't know. We could split hairs and we could get deeper into that, but I ain't, because I ain't dealing with all that bullshit right now. But I did want to talk about a couple cults and what their similarities were, what their beliefs were, what they thought about, and kind of what their overview of, what their structure was, and what they were about. So the first one that I wanted to talk about was Jonestown. So Jonestown took place November 18th, 1978, and it was the location of a mass murder-suicide of members of the California-based People's Temple cult, and they were led by a psychopath, paranoid leader named Jim Jones. And Jim Jones was actually, before he was a cult leader, he was, he was a very highly regarded guy. He was very, very, he was charismatic. He was a good speaker. He was able to get people's attention. But Jonestown was, it was the largest mass death in American history until 9/11, which is pretty insane. The death toll exceeded 900 people, and there were 300 plus who were under the age of 17. So they were all kids. 300 people were kids. It's wild to think about that, and it's wild to see the pictures of Jonestown. And if you Google them, they pop right up, and you could see aerial photos of a helicopter flying over this big ass So Jonestown was in Guyana. Guyana is near Venezuela, but these were all Americans, and I wondered why all these Americans were over there, and I was like, So what's the story behind that? But Jim Jones opened his first church in the mid-1950s in Indianapolis. At the time, he was not affiliated with any particular denomination, and he had no theological training. His congregation was known for being like racially integrated, and he was like very pivotal in, it was very adamant by him that he was able to integrate African Americans and all races into a certain religion. And this all happened in the mid 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Like, that's really not, that's pretty progressive for him to be a white guy. Jim Jones is white, and it was pretty progressive for a white guy to want to, integrate different religions into anything that they're doing. People back then are, they're racist as hell, and it's in Indiana. But in 1960, Jones's congregation, by then it was called the People's Temple. It was affiliated with the Disciples of Christ. And 4 years later, Jones was ordained in that church. And in the mid-60s, he and his wife incorporated the People's Temple in California, and they settled outside the town of Ukiah, or Ukiah, and they had about 100 followers. So he had 100 followers in this like organization that he kind of started with. I wanted to know what Jim Jones was like as a young kid, and because you want to know like what type of person is able to do this. But as I start reading, this kid was a little bit off. Jim Jones was born in like this back ass part of Indiana, and the family was poor. They had to move away. They lived in a house with no plumbing. He didn't really have any friends, but he was a crazy reader. Like, he was really intelligent, graduated early, but like he read all the time. But he studied weird ass people, and he studied like Hitler, he studied Stalin, he studied Marx, and basically he studied, anyone that was like able to, kind of round up a mass of people. He wanted to know how to control and manipulate people. But he, there was acquaintances that I read about that said that he was a real creepy ass kid that was like fascinated with death and like would kill animals, but who knows? That's all hearsay. Who knows what an acquaintance knows about Jim Jones? But he did have like a fascination with religion, and I guess some say that it was because, that involved him in a community, and, he didn't have any friends, so he wanted to be accepted. He wanted people to like him. He wanted people to, to follow him, and he wanted to be like the focus, you know what I mean? And, which is understandable, that's super understandable, but it's weird because I was reading about like, he was adamant about integrating different races. So you would think someone like that would be, like a little bit, what was the reasoning behind that? Like, was his family, did they share the same, beliefs and values of integrating races in the world in such a wild time of racism? But it wasn't. His dad was supposedly, pretty racist. Like he had a African American friend who his dad would not let in the house, and Jim Jones just ended up hating his father. And this acquaintance also said that his father like participated in the Ku Klux Klan, and you're thinking like, how did that kid, he basically just broke away from his father. He lived with his mother. His mom and his father got divorced, and I don't know what happened to his father. There wasn't really too much information about that, but he basically just lived with his mother in a different part of Indiana. But they grew up, basically just poor. You know what I mean? But he became a teacher. He went to school for secondary education, and he graduated early. And like I said, this dude was a genius. He definitely was like super smart. But he after he like did the teaching thing, he became fascinated with religion to the point where he wanted to get involved with it. And he wanted to become a pastor under the Mormon church, under the Methodist church. I'm sorry, but the Methodist church, had a problem whenever he kind of raised the issue that he wanted to incorporate different races. They were basically just like, nah. And because, like, you think about it, 60s in Indiana, like, people were racist. You know, he probably got looked down upon on that for sure. But this dude ended up, like, you know, stepping away from the Methodist church, and you know, in his practices of, like, you know, going to different services, he went to, like, a Baptist church. And in this Baptist church, he saw, like, a community that, like, this community environment that, like, kind of sparked an idea in his mind that he wanted to kind of start the same thing. Like, he saw how much money churches were bringing in, how many of the followers people were bringing in, how these people looked at the priests and the figures of the church. And, you know, for someone who wasn't accepted, it was probably easy for him to, like, want to be involved in that. And so, like, he started to, like, kind of develop a plan on how to make this church happen. And this dude was wild. So he would import monkeys, and then he would go door to door and sell them. And, like, that was a way that he was raising money to try to, like, you know, build a church. And it turns out that he basically just had this, like, what the hell is the word? It was basically just like a religious convention. That's it. He organized a religious convention, and after he did that, it kind of, like, gave him some clout. You know, people started recognizing him in the church community. People started seeing him as someone who was, like, you know, beneficial, who was bringing people together, and he was getting a lot of respect from a lot of people because he was so active in, you know, the integration of different races. You know, like, it's weird for a white dude back then to be, you know, so outspoken about this. So, like, he had a strong following of, like, the African American communities and people who were advocating that. And he's like, so after he did this whole religious convention, he started this church, and it was called the People's Temple Christian Church Full Gospel. And it's wild because, like, 4 years later, after he started this church, he was ordained in that church. And in the mid 1960s, him and his wife incorporated the People's Temple in California. And after they were in California, they settled into this town of Ukiah, and they had like 100 followers, and that would be 100 followers is a decent amount of people. But they went from moving to Indiana where they started this church to California because it was just like a bigger pool of people. And they projected the move as it was in protection of like a nuclear holocaust. Like, he was someone that believed that there was going to be like a nuclear holocaust. And, like, that was a way for him to kind of like, get people to like follow along with what he was like doing. But in 1970s, Jones began holding services in like San Francisco. And in like, by 1972, he had opened another temple in LA, and this dude began making friends among like politicians and in the press and all through California. And he became like a respected churchman. He had thousands of followers. There was a large percentage of them who were like African American. And, that brought more people to him because he was like, he was the guy that was advocating for change. And, he had like a weird like practice. Like he had displays of like mind reading and like faith healing, and you're just like, what? And this dude basically looks like how do I want to describe him? He looks like a weird Elvis look. He has some black hair. He wears dark glasses. I don't know. It's very, very strange. But while the People's Temple was active in humanitarian causes in its communities, Jones's treatment of his followers was often less humane. So like, people thought that this dude was doing like all kinds of great things, but like his followers were like the proof that it wasn't. So people would see, just on the surface that this guy was donating money. He was, part of this community. He was doing things to help better the community. But like there were temple members that were like regularly humiliated, beaten, blackmailed, and all of them, like a lot of people were coerced and like brainwashed into signing over their possessions, including their homes. And they were all convinced to sign everything over to the church, and like black members and members of the other minority groups were convinced that if they left the People's Temple, they would be rounded up into government-run concentration camps, and family members were kept apart and encouraged to inform on one another. And if you think about how wild that is, it's like, on the surface, everything looks all fine and dandy. And like, this is all like a great organization and good shit is happening. But like, there's definitely some workings behind the scenes of how crazy shit is becoming. And, people like he made it so basically if people did not follow along with what he wanted it to, you were supposed to just like kind of shun those people and like, get those people out of your life. And, in 1977, after members of the press began to ask questions about Jones's operation, he moved with like hundreds of people into this town of Jonestown. And this is a compound that he's been building in Guyana near Venezuela for 3 to 4 years. So before all this wild shit happened and all these people were like questioning what he was doing, he basically was like trying to push on people that he wanted to create this sort of like utopian world. And it was weird because like, I don't know. Me personally, like if I would have seen like, why does this guy want to go across the world and do this? It might raise some flags to me, but back then people just thought that this guy was like literally creating a brand new world that all these people could live as one into this new beautiful place. And I'm sure that he like, spun it to make it sound like it was something just insane. But, people were there in Guyana, like building this community basically for a couple years before he even showed up over there and started living there. And in this time, people like really enjoyed what they were doing. People were happy. They didn't have to worry about like money or anything like that. Their job was to build this community, build up Jonestown, build this place as somewhere where, everyone could be as one person. And like, there's videos of these people doing interviews as like they're building up this place. And it's basically them talking about how there's like, 8-hour work days and like, they're trying to become self-sustaining and like they're using these expressions like, this is your own world. You do what you please. You work as one for your community. And they make it seem like it's going to be like fantastic how, everyone would think people would make it seem, have your own rules, do what you want. But, there's always two sides to the coin. And I guess like as this was going on and people were starting to build this community, Jim Jones was still in California, like running services and trying to like recruit new people. And it's wild to think about that because like, I don't know, people just thought that everything was going to be good over there as they're building. But then, the FBI started to get all crazy and started to investigate what Jim Jones was doing at his church because, it was a fucking cult. They started to realize it was a cult and, they started to research him and they started to, look into his organization and that kind of like, spooked him. And at one time, and that's whenever in 97, that's whenever he moved with all these other people and moved over to Jonestown for good. And that's whenever like kind of shit changed for everyone. Everyone that was there before Jim Jones arrived like said that it was just great there. It was a beautiful place. But then once he arrived, things started to like kind of turn into a prison camp, if you will. This guy was just like a leader of this like prison camp basically. And it was just a compound. But people started to like dislike the way that things were going when Jim Jones arrived. He was nuts. I found out that he was like, I was reading a lot of this stuff, and some of these people said that he was on drugs a lot, and I wanted to know if that was true. So I started reading about it, and I guess that this dude was just dope to the gills all day. He would be taking pain pills, amphetamines, all of this shit. And I guess like, through members of the church, he would like get people to write him prescriptions, whether they'd be doctors or what, or he would go see doctors, and he would like, basically tell them, like, I need something to keep me awake. But he would just take all these pain pills, and I guess that started to make his mind deteriorate or some shit. But in 1978, in November, U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan traveled to Guyana to inspect the People's Temple's activities and in the Jonestown compound. And he was investigating rumors that some of the cult members were being held against their will and that some were being subjected to physical and psychological abuse. And after traveling to Guyana's capital, Georgetown, on November 14th, he arrived at Jonestown on the 17th. So the following day, Ryan, I guess, was like touring Jonestown, and I guess people were just on like their best behavior, but everything seemed great. Like this guy brought a video, or brought like a whole video team with him. Like a lot of this shit is on tape that you could find online right now and watch. And I could see this Congressman Ryan talking to all these people from Jonestown and like asking them, and all these people from Jonestown are basically like, this is the best place I've ever been in my life. This is heaven on earth. Like, we want to be here, and everything seemed to be great. And like, the congressman was like, basically, we don't see nothing wrong here. Everyone seems to be having a great time. And I guess like after the cameras and everything were turned off, and later that night, someone passed him a note that said like, help us get out of here. And turns out that Jim Jones was like a fucking nut job, and he had armed guards. And if you were, going against him at all, he would make an example of you. Like he would beat you, he would ridicule you, he would use you as an example in front of a community that he had in front of him. He would, I'm sure he just killed people. 100% he just killed people. There's no way he didn't. But, after Congressman Ryan got that paperwork, he took it to Jim Jones, and he was like, what's this then? And Jim Jones like got bothered immediately, and he was like, oh, people were always just trying to play games. There's never any force here. Like people could leave whenever they want. If they like, no one's forcing them to be here. Everyone's here by their own free will. So I guess what happened was the congressman went around with the interview team and started interviewing some people. And after one or two of the cult members like kind of said, they voiced their opinions and their concerns and said they wanted to go home, Jim Jones started to get, visibly, bothered by this, and started to get kind of annoyed. And, one of the cult members like tried to pull out a knife and, go after one of the congressman's people. And, immediately everyone was like, what the fuck? So Jim Jones was like, all right, just leave. And all these people that supposedly wanted to leave, they follow Congressman Ryan out the next day. And the following day, when Ryan was set to return home, several temple members who wanted to leave the compound boarded his delegation's truck in order to accompany him back to the United States. So they were just going to get flown they were going to get driven to an airstrip, and then they were going to go back to the United States because they wanted to get out of this fucking cult. So after the congressman was able to, get out of, Jonestown without being hurt, he rounded up the people that wanted to get out of this cult, and they all went to this airstrip. Okay, they all took trucks to go back to this airstrip, and they were all going to fly back to the United States. But whenever they got to this airstrip, there was people that got into, there was two planes. There was people that got into the first plane, and I guess while people were getting into the second plane, this group of people, armed guards from Jonestown called the Red Brigade, they came to the airstrip and they just started shooting all these people. All right. And it's insane because this dude had a camera crew and there's video of this actually happening. There's video of the truck pulling up and there's video of, these dudes just shooting at this airplane and stuff like that. And it said, the temple members attacked, this airstrip, and Ryan and his company, were basically under fire, and 5 people, including Ryan and 3 members of the press, were shot and killed, and 11 people were wounded. And then, in the wake of the shooting, after people found out what this was, as all this shit is happening and like all these people are leaving the cult and Congressman Ryan and all them are on their way back to the U.S., Jim Jones started this thing called the death tape. It's known as the death tape right now, but it's a 45-minute long recording that's happening in the same time that all this other shit is happening with like the airstrip and everything. You could hear him just talking about what happened. You could hear him talking about how there wanted to be a revolutionary suicide. But in this tape that I listened to, it's 45 minutes. You can find it on YouTube. It's called the Jonestown Death Tape. You could hear, as he's talking, someone come in and says, the congressman is dead. And then you could hear Jim Jones just say, "What a legacy, what a legacy." And then I guess like that's the moment in time that he was like, we're going to enact this revolutionary suicide. And that's basically what happened. So, some of the people that got gunned down on this airship, that didn't die, they escaped the woods and, they escaped into the jungle and they ended up getting rescued. And there's some interviews with these people, online that are actually pretty crazy. People that were in the airplane that the people got killed in. But in the wake of the shooting, Jones released radio orders for temple members outside of the compound to commit suicide. So like he had this idea that everyone was going to, do this revolutionary suicide, but there was people that were outside of the compound at different places that he instructed to kill themselves. Like there was a group of people in I think it was Georgetown that were playing in a basketball tournament, including his son, Jim Jones Jr. He was playing in this basketball tournament, and I guess he got on like a radio. He got a call on the radio that said like, you guys got to commit suicide right now. It's happening. And then, after that, Jones enacted his revolutionary suicide plan in the compound, which members had practiced in the past, in which, Whenever I say people practice this in the past, Jim Jones was so crazy to the point where, he would test people's dedication by, waking them up out of the middle of the night and bringing them into a tent and saying, here is this drink it. This is gonna, you're gonna die if you drink this. This is poison. And people would just drink it. They were like, I'm all for it. I'm a ride or die. And then after they drank it, he would be like, oh, you're not going to die. I was just testing you. And that's pretty wild to think about. But this whole big suicide pact all revolved around, that expression, don't sip the Kool-Aid, because there was a fruit drink that was laced. It was knockoff Kool-Aid. I think it was called Flavor Aid, but it was a grape drink that was laced with cyanide, tranquilizers, Valiums, and, some other random ass shit. But, Jonestown it was a community, so they had their own doctor and everything like that. So everything was like very, very like understood and regimented. And they were planning this ahead of time because all this cyanide was ordered months beforehand. And I guess this was all just a matter of time on when it was going to happen. But the doctor ended up mixing up these batches of all this poison Kool-Aid, and so it was first squirted into the mouths of babies and children's via syringe, and then imbibed by adult members. So the adults had to basically just, make the babies and the little kids eat this poison because they weren't going to do it voluntarily. And in this death tape I was talking about that you could find on YouTube, you could hear all this shit happening. You could hear him saying hurry up. He was saying quickly, quickly, let's go, my children. And all these people were calling this dude daddy, and like it's fucking creepy. You could hear kids crying in the background. You could hear people cheering whenever he's talking about killing himself. And then you just hear little kids crying about shit. And as the 40 minutes go by, you just hear less and less people talking. And you're just like, that is creepy. But yeah, they first squirted it into the mouths of babies and the children. And after that happened, all these like adults, like there was these big vats of this Kool-Aid with all the poison in it. And they would all go over and they would sip this Kool-Aid, and people just started fucking dying, I guess. But it made me think, like, for 900 people, there had to be some people that were not down with it. Like once someone died, people were probably like, I ain't doing this. I'm scared. So I guess from what I read, you know, these armed guards like forcefully made people drink this shit. So, I mean, this wasn't all a mass suicide. This was a murder suicide, because obviously these kids didn't know what was happening. These people just killed these kids. So there was a bunch of, I mean, it's just a fucked up situation that happened. But it turns out Jim Jones was a bitch and he didn't do it himself. He ended up being found with a gunshot wound in the head. And then I looked up what it would be like to be killed by cyanide. And it's weird because like, you know, it's very, very dark. It's very, very dark to read about what it was like to die by cyanide poisoning. But they said it's not in any way a painless death. They said that the deaths in Jonestown took anywhere between 5 to 20 minutes, and it said first your entire body starts to convulse, then your mouth fills with a mixture of saliva, blood, and vomit, then you pass out, and then you die. Your body is deprived of oxygen completely, and supposedly it's a horrific death. But on this audio recording, there's this lady named Maria Katsaris, and that was one of Jim Jones's mistresses and right-hand women. But she comes onto the microphone while all this is happening, and while the group is being like not forced, but while the group is being told to kill themselves, and she is directing them on where to stand in line. And she says, you know, after she hears all these little kids crying, you could hear her say, it's not painful, they're just crying because it tastes bitter. But supposedly it was extremely painful for everyone. But they talked about revolutionary suicide because it was something they talked about at meetings and the best way to do it. They thought about guillotines, lining everyone up in front of a ditch and shooting them in the head. And eventually the idea of poison started coming up during the brainstorming sessions. But it's not really clear who came up with it. But Jim Jones is definitely the one that put it into practice. And then and people were wondering, like, you know, what about using poison specifically? Why not use one of the other methods? And then that's one of those existential questions that isn't really answerable, because all of the people who had the answers are dead, and there wasn't really any idea on how they do it. But I guess they were just looking for like a mass way to do it. And I guess, like, you know, maybe shooting people is a little bit more difficult than just having everyone just drink a drink. But the cyanide was mixed in with that flavor aid and with Valium. And then there was the doctor who was Jonestown's doctor was named Larry Schatt. I guess it was Schatt. It's whatever his name is. And he had a couple nurses under him as well. And he was the guy that Jim Jones has taken off the street, and Jones had an uncanny ability. He had an uncanny ability for putting people in positions that they knew they would excel in. And he wasn't like a great doctor, but, you know, Jim Jones picked him off the street, paid for his way to go through medical school, and I think that was in turn for him to have like an in with a doctor to get some drugs and shit like that. But I read questions on, like, how did he know how to make the poison correctly with the right proportions of each ingredient? And it says that it was something he'd been working on for a while, and he ordered the cyanide in summertime, like months beforehand. So they definitely planned it. And they were wondering, I saw some questions, why Flavor Aid? Why like this Kool-Aid? And it was just the drink choice of the commune, and it was cheaper than Kool-Aid. And it was so the commune that they built was only supposed to originally house like 500 people, but there was 900. So like the most of the time they like were eating less and less food because they didn't have enough, and they were basically just looking for real cheap ways to do all this stuff. So cyanide like tasted like bitter almonds supposedly, and people were just drinking all this shit. And there was some people who supposedly like pushed against it in the beginning, but were just coerced to do it. And it's very very weird to think about like how everything was kind of planned out. And it's very weird to think about how these people kind of made this shit last for as long as it did, because like, this whole like cult went on for like over 20 years. But all these people that died, there was less than 100 people from Guyana in Jonestown that did not die. And those were the people that were like off on that basketball thing, or the people that like, who left that day, who wanted to get out of the cult, that left with the congressman, who escaped from that attack. And it's wild to think about that, because like, if you live in this, like these people just lived in this like community forever, or not forever, but for many years. And like, it was just like this family. And it was just like, it's wild to think about like how the people that are survivors, like what they would feel today. But I don't know. But after all this shit happened, officials discovered like a big ass cache of firearms, hundreds of people's passports that they took off them whenever they signed into the cult, basically. So whenever you signed up for the cult, they just like took all your belongings. The only thing you had was some clothes. They took all your money. They took everything. But, after all these people died and they went and they checked all this shit out, they found a bunch of money. There was millions of dollars in bank accounts overseas. But I don't know. Supposedly the temple disbanded in 1978 through bankruptcy, and I don't know. It was wild, because like this whole thing was, I guess, it's hard because Jim Jones was preaching socialism, like he wanted a community that was like, everyone was involved, but like realistically, it was like an aggressive form of communism. He wanted to be the leader. He was like literally telling people like, life is not worth living unless I'm here with you. Like I'm doing everything in my power every day to give you a better life. And, he was a fucking cult leader. He made everything, he spun everything a certain way to get this following by all these people. And it's super weird and dark to listen to that Jonestown death tape, but it's interesting to hear about it. It really is interesting to hear about it. But again, 900 plus people died at this place, and 300, some of them were kids, and that's super fucked up. I mean, it's fucked up that everyone died, but it's fucked up that like all these babies and shit like that and these young kids all died because, their parents were fucking nuts. And I don't know, it's wild. There's a lot of shit online with like videos of this, of like, recordings of him speaking. And, I listened to this whole 45-minute death talk because I wanted to hear, how he spoke and like what he sounded like and why people, gave their life for this guy and, wanted to do anything they could to like, follow this guy. And it's so creepy to listen to the way he speaks. Like he's so adamant and passionate and, like very, very like sure of everything. And like, I don't know, maybe I'm just not like a weak-minded person. I don't know. none of me, nothing that this guy said was appealing to me, but you wonder, like, how could 900 people be like this? Like, what was so good about this guy that 900 people believed what he was doing was legit? And why the fuck did they all kill themselves? And there's just some answers that you don't know. This guy was involved in like all kinds of shit, and I'm sure that there's more details that I didn't cover, but like, that's basically the gist of that one. And it's heavy. It's definitely heavy shit. So the next one that I wanted to talk about was Heaven's Gate. So Jonestown was the biggest mass murder suicide, and then there's Heaven's Gate, which is one of the biggest ones in the United States. This happened in Jonestown happened in Guyana, so it wasn't considered into the United States, but Heaven's Gate was 20 years later, and it was pretty significant. So Heaven's Gate is this all is another cult, but it's a little bit different. So like, the Jonestown shit was a cult because they wanted to build this like utopia. They basically wanted individuality and freedom of, all things. They wanted to be their own. I don't know. I don't really know the actual reason of why he did it. It was kind of like bizarre, but Heaven's Gate is a little bit more weird to me. So Heaven's Gate, 39 members total killed themselves in March of 1997. And this was in Rancho Santa Fe, California. And the two leaders are Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. Okay. At the time of people killing themselves, it was only Marshall Applewhite because Bonnie Nettles died. But the belief was that there was this comet coming, the Hale-Bopp comet, which came around every 2,000 years. And the belief that Marshall Applewhite told all these 39 people is that this comet was coming, and behind this comet directly was a UFO that was going to scoop these people up from their vehicles, aka their bodies, and take them into a higher level, which is, heaven, I guess. But this shit is wild. Everyone, these 39 people all wore like the same uniform, all had buzzed heads, all had the same shit in their pockets, all was wearing the same shoes, the same black sweatsuit, had a purple blanket over them. So it like kind of has like a weirder, obviously people drinking a bunch of poison is weird, but like all these different things about the Heaven's Gate shit is weird. Like, why do people have purple blankets over them? Why were they wearing Nike Decade shoes? Why did they decide to kill themselves? So the first thing is first, I wanted to figure out what the leaders of this cult were all about. And like I said, there was two people. There was Marshall Applewhite, who was, he was from Corpus Christi, and I guess that he was just a regular dude, I guess that he was a regular dude for the majority of the beginning of his life. He was from Ohio. He served in the Army. He was married, and he taught music at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. And, I guess he was somewhat normal up to like the 1970s when his life fell apart. His life fell apart because, he was accused of having sexual relations with a man or with a male student. So I guess his wife was just like, fuck you, I'm out. And then a year after his wife left, his father died. So he was just like in this crazy, depressed, weird state. And then all of a sudden he met this crazy lady named Bonnie Nettles. Now, a little bit of history on Bonnie Nettles. Bonnie Nettles was from Houston, and I guess somewhat normal if you can consider someone who believes in talking to dead people and believing that, this lady's daughter did an interview, and the interview, she talks about how her mom would take her into the backyard and they would just stare up in the sky and wait for aliens to come and get them. So I guess this lady was a little fucking whacked, but she did kind of carry some normal tendencies. She was a registered nurse. She had some children. So like back then, I guess people might consider her a little bit normal, but her husband was getting, he started to smell the weirdness. In 1972, there was a marriage that fell apart, and I guess her husband was just like, fuck this, because she started saying that like these 19th century monks were speaking to her and telling her to do certain things. And she started doing these seances and would talk to mediums. And, she just wanted to communicate with like the afterlife. And, to me, that's weird. I guess some people might think that's normal, but, she held these like weekly meetings to study all this shit at her house, astrology, mysticism, natural magic. And his husband was probably like, bitch, you're crazy. And let me tell you one thing. If I came into my house and I saw Antoinette with some candles lit and a pentagram on the ground, I'd toss her ass right out the second story window. No questions at all. Some wild shit like The Craft. But supposedly after she got divorced and everything, she talked to one of her fortune tellers that she always talked to, and this fortune teller told her that she was going to meet a mysterious tall man with white hair that was very, very, fair complexioned, and surprise, Marshall Applewhite definitely fits that description. But supposedly in 1972, Marshall and Betty met, and from one of the readings that Marshall Applewhite had, it said they met in a hospital whenever they were both there for some reason. She was a nurse and he was supposedly there meeting someone, but I guess, they crossed paths, they stared at each other, and they had some crazy, weird, strong mental connection. And from that point on, I guess they were just like inseparable, and it made me think, like, are these people banging? Are they attracted to each other romantically? And I guess they weren't. Sex was a no-no in Heaven's Gate because it's been known. Marshall Applewhite got in trouble because of him being a sexual deviant. So I guess they just understood that it just brought problems. So that was just like, it wasn't a part of their values. But that Betty Nettles' daughter, she did say that, she thought that that Betty and Marshall knew each other because they both like were at the theater. They met at the theater, some shit like that. So it's kind of vague on how they met, and it's kind of, who knows. But regardless, they met, and whenever they met in 72, they would just meet and they would talk about all their beliefs and all this mysticism and all the weird shit that they believed in together, and aliens and everything. And in 1973, they just like up and decided that they were going to go, spread the word, spread their beliefs to all these different people. And they went on this road trip for like a year, and they would just travel around, and Betty would send her daughter letters saying that like something big was about to happen, all this weird shit. This lady was fucking whacked. But, she just left for a year with this dude, and they went around and they were trying to recruit people. And as they were like recruiting people very slowly, the Marshall Applewhite dude got arrested because I guess he had a rental car and he never returned it. And then he ended up getting arrested and he went to jail for like 6 months. But in that 6 months of him being in jail, that's whenever he kind of like hammered out his beliefs of what was going on. That was like whenever he fine-tuned his doctrine. And whenever he got out, they were ready to recruit people at a quicker rate. So after they got some followers and they started to get some recruits and they started to have some people that were ready to, kind of go along with what they were preaching, they were, their main goal was to kind of raise money. And as they were raising money, basically what they were doing was they were going to sell their blood at blood donation or at blood banks or whatever the hell you call them, and they were going around asking people for donations for this. And I guess they got a few people that were like, all right, and they donated a significant amount of money. But they built up a following of like 60 to 70 people, kind of vague on how many people it was, but they went from being, during this road trip, they all ended up in Oregon, and it was known that they were there, this organization, and then all of a sudden they just all disappeared. No one knew where they were. And, fast forward a little bit of time, they pop up again, and it turns out they were just off the grid. They were just staying in campgrounds, like 60 to 70 of them were just going across the country, staying in campgrounds. They were only staying in states that had like good vibes. And I think like California was one, Colorado was one, and they had like good energy states. I think that's what they called them. But basically what they were preaching was the whole idea that this life was a stepping stone to something more. They were basically, you know, in a nutshell, they're basically butterflies, and once they die, they're gonna participate in a metamorphosis which takes them to a higher level, basically what heaven is, I guess. But they didn't know when something was coming, but they just knew something bigger was coming. And you know, it's weird because if you got these people in these cults, you know, I'm sure not everyone is so, you know, easily, you know, convinced that this shit is real. So one of the kids who were in these cults, like his mom ended up, you know, this guy was basically just like, Mom, I'm leaving. I have a calling. Like, this stuff is what I believe in. This is what's happening. And he just left his mom. And I guess his mom developed or, you know, created this newsletter for, you know, the family of these cult members, because like if you're shunned from these cult members, you're obviously concerned about them. You're obviously like, these people are fucking whacked and they're brainwashed. You know, you're concerned about them. If a mother has a son that's in a cult, you know, if my kid was in a cult, I would go down there like fucking Schwarzenegger in Predator, taking people out, and I would bring my kid's ass back home, and I would put a fucking eye hook in the basement of my house and chain him to the bottom of the basement. And, you know, I'd probably make them watch Disney movies or something, but they would not be in a cult, I'll tell you that. But she made this newsletter, and I guess the newsletter was getting around to people, and the cult people found out that she had this newsletter. And this newsletter was like basically just speaking about details of what's going on, and it kind of made like the Applewhites, Marshall Applewhite and Betty Nettles, it kind of like raised concerns because like they started to get worried that because people were reading this newsletter, they were going to try to come back and like, you know, take their kids back, you know, rightly so, because that's what a normal human being would do. But to kind of combat that, you know, they let the cult members communicate with the outside, but they did it very regimented. You know, it's very, very weird. And what I'm about to do is play a voice message from this lady's son, because again, she made this newsletter, and I guess that they caught wind of it, and he was instructed to call her and let her know that if she puts the names of the people that want contact from their loved ones that are in this cult, put it in the newsletter and we will call them. But they have to promise not to, you know, come and try to like take us away from the cult, because we're here very willingly. So listen to this voicemail. It's wild.
Hello, this is your son David. If you want to know how you can help these parents who want to hear from someone on the trip, if you would print in your newsletter the names of those parents who will promise not to kidnap their family members or keep them from doing what they want to do, I'll promise you that most of these parents will hear from their loved ones pretty quickly. And I don't want you to worry about me, because there's really nothing to worry about.
Shit is super creepy, right? Again, that's the son of this lady who created this newsletter. And I don't know, it just sounds super weird. Like he sounds like a robot almost. But and I guess after that, it kind of like, you know, took the heat off of him a little bit, because, you know, there wasn't really anything else up until the next event in the life of the human, or the life of the Heaven's Gate cult, which is whenever Betty Nettles or Bonnie Nettles, I don't know if I'm calling her Betty or Bonnie, but it's Bonnie Nettles. Bonnie Nettles was diagnosed with and later died of cancer. And I guess Applewhite didn't tell her family or anything, and like until like 7 months later, which is fucking insane. But this lady just died, and I guess that kind of caused some concern for the people that were involved in the cult, because, you know, Bonnie Nettles and Marshall Applewhite were supposedly, you know, the leaders of this, you know, this world, and they were supposedly God. And, you know, these people told these cult followers that they were extraterrestrials in human bodies, and they were recruiting people back for something better. And, you know, they got as weird to the point where they were telling the cult followers to address them as Doe and T. So they had like these weird nicknames. Everyone in the cult had their own names that they came up with, and they were just super, super weird. But, you know, after a lot of people were concerned that like something weird was going on because this lady died of cancer, you know, like if she's a prophet, like why wasn't she, you know, on the front lines? Why wasn't she taken care of by like these greater powers? And, you know, it started to make Marshall Applewhite kind of freaked out, I guess. So what he did was he just kind of like made everything, you know, a little bit more regimented. He put people on shorter leashes, and, I don't know. It's kind of crazy to think about. Like, you know, I guess some people were trying to like get out of it a little bit, but you weren't allowed to communicate with people who were outside of the organization. You know, their food was regimented. What they did was regimented. You weren't allowed to like have sex. You weren't allowed to have money. You know, it wasn't about pleasure at all. There was no extra pleasure. You know, the sole purpose for these people were that they were cleansing their bodies and becoming pure for when something bigger came after them to take them away. And it got crazy to the point where, like, you know, so Marshall Applewhite never really like had a lot of communication with the male members of the Heaven's Gate cult because, you know, supposedly he was a homosexual, and like he wanted to fight those urges of him sexually being attracted to other people. And you know, he started to come up to the male members of the cult and ask them if they would be, you know, willing to voluntarily castrate themselves. Do you know what castration is? Cut your nuts off. For people that don't know what it is. But 6 people said yes. 6 people, and Marshall Applewhite flew to Mexico, and they all got castrated voluntarily to fight the urge of sexual, the sexual urge of other people, which is wild to me. And supposedly, a couple of the people who were in the cult that got out of it, you know, I watched some interviews from them. That was enough for one of the guys. He was like, I ain't doing that, and kind of stepped away from there. But you know, after this wildness just keeps ensuing, and like people were cutting their nuts off, and, you know, they're still trying to get, you know, some new people into their organization, you know, time just goes by and they just keep building with what they're doing. And it's not until the early 90s whenever Marshall Applewhite kind of got creative, and he started to use the internet to spread the word to the outside world. And the actual website is still up. You could look at it right now, www.heavensgate.com. And it's pretty creepy. There's this thing that flashes at the top that says red alert, and I guess that was for whenever the comet was coming back then. I guess the page has not changed since the suicide, but people still, I mean, you have to pay for it. So I guess people that are still active in the Heaven's Gate cult are paying for it and making sure that it's still up and running. But it's wild to look at. Very, very bizarre. But he was creating websites and like different business ventures like that, and he was making bank, like $400,000 a year. And they were making enough money that they were taking out full page ads in USA Today, which is wild to think about. And they were trying to like recruit for this new second wave of people. But I don't know, because like, you know, it says that there was like 70 people at one time. I don't know where the other, you know, 30 people went, but one night they were all camping and they got a sign, supposedly. Marshall Applewhite saw this red sky, but it ended up being from, you know, the wildfires in California that caused the sky to be red, but he thought that the end times were near. So he started to research, and he found out about Hale-Bopp, which was a comet that came around once every 2,000 years. And that's whenever he started to say that, like, you know, this spaceship is coming and it's going to be trailing this comet. So like, this is the sign that we need. Like, this is what's going to happen. Like, we have to be prepared for what's going to happen. It's coming. So they just started like preparing themselves. They all started to like film their exit videos, which are basically interviews that are with the members, and they're just talking about like, you know, what they're doing in the cult, and like that they're under their own free will, and do not think of Marshall Applewhite or Bonnie Nettles as bad people, because this is voluntarily something they want to do. They're lucky to be here. It is super creepy if you look them up. And then there is one last hour and a half long video by Marshall Applewhite, or Doe, called Doe's Final Exit, which is basically just him sitting in front of all these people dressed in black, being creepy, spewing some wild shit. And I was looking up these videos and I was listening to them, and I'm just like, I don't understand how people were this fucking stupid to follow what these nut jobs were saying. I don't know. Nothing of it, I'm trying to go into shit with an open mind. Nothing of it made me feel that, this shit might be legit. And I'm not saying I don't believe in aliens or nothing, but this is even a little bit more outrageous than just believing that there are aliens. But I started to look at their operation and where they were living and what the details were of the day of the suicide. So again, in March 1997, it turns out that all these people killed themselves in this big ass mansion. So they ended up renting this mansion, and they were paying $7,000 cash per month. And it turns out the month, or within the month that they all killed themselves, they filed for abduction insurance. I'm not really sure what that is, but supposedly it was $1,000 insurance policy on anyone who was abducted. And who knows if that was real or not, but I thought that was interesting. But the whole organization, so it was basically just a big ass house, but there was bunk beds in there. Everyone had their own uniform, which was the same all black sweatsuit, the same pair of black Nike Decade shoes, which are now discontinued and which now could be sold for a very, very high price. But I wondered, why do these people have black on? Why do these people have black Nike shoes? And it turns out that I think that they just got a really, really good deal on a bulk order of these shoes. That's all it boiled down to. But Nike ended up discontinuing them after the Heaven's Gate shit. That's why they're worth so much money. But these people were drinking, or these people ate this poison, which was a mix of barbiturate and either some applesauce, pudding, or vodka, and they would eat this shit. Some of them put a bag over their heads, and they would lay into this bunk bed with a purple blanket over them, and that blanket was to signify that it was to let them know where the UFO was to, take these people up. And in their pockets, this is where it kind of got a little bit confusing, because I saw two different details of it. One said that there was $5 in quarters in all of their pockets. And then the other article said that in their pockets was a $5 bill, which was for vagrancy fines, and then 3/4 to call home. I don't know if that means that that was for the afterlife or what, but supposedly all these people had this shit in their pocket. And, it's just super weird to me because I don't know. It is hard for me to think about cults. It is hard for me to think about people being involved in cults. It's hard for me because I'm a skeptic kind of. If someone was like, "Hey, the spaceship's coming down to get you," I'm going to be quizzing the fuck out of this person. 20 questions. How do you know? Where'd you get your information from? How do I know that this is true? Why should I believe you? What makes me think that you're real? Did you grow up in religion? I would be firing questions off at these people. But, Marshall Applewhite died. He's dead. And Bonnie Nettles is obviously dead, and 39 people died there. And, a couple people did not die. A couple people were not there that were members of the Heaven's Gate cult that were still alive but ended up killing themselves later. But it's wild. It's wild to read about all this shit, and it's wild to hear how people speak about it, because it's obviously something that people believed in to the point where they were going to kill their children over it. You know what I mean? Kill themselves over these figures that they were so devoted to, with Jim Jones and Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. But, cults are creepy. It's creepy. Look at Charles Manson. I'm 99.9% sure he didn't kill anyone. He just convinced people to kill people. And that's creepy as fuck to think about. But if you wanted to look into this a little bit more, there's a lot of shit online. And like I said, for the Jonestown one, there's a YouTube video called The Jonestown Death Tape, which is Reverend Jim Jones, and it's a 45-minute tape of him just talking about everything leading up to him dying. And it is wild. It's very dark. You hear kids crying. You hear people, voicing their concerns on not wanting to kill themselves. You hear someone, bringing up the fact that they don't want the kids to die, and it's basically just Jim Jones shutting them down, saying, I could promise you that life is not worth living unless I'm here, and I'm going to kill myself, so you got to also. And you're just like, you're a fucking nut. And then, Marshall Applewhite is, his videos are fucking wild to watch because he's this bug-eyed, weird, creepy old guy. And, what else is there to say? Cults are crazy. I mean, some people are involved in pyramid schemes right now, and that might be the closest thing to it. A lot of people compare religion and cults, and as I said before, that's a super touchy subject. I ain't getting too deep down into that because, arguing religion and politics is the dumbest things you could ever do because, no one's ever right. Some people are adamant that in their beliefs, I could be adamant in my beliefs, and I don't want to disrespect people's beliefs. I guess I don't want to disrespect people's beliefs, but I thought it was interesting. I actually have a piece of merchandise that is kind of inspired by the Heaven's Gate cult. It's called the Take a Sip tee. It's on my website right now, www.illcallyouRightBack.com. Check it out. I think there's some hoodies and some t-shirts on there. But I'm obviously not a cult, but people listen to me talk every week. It's just a play on words. I like dark shit. I obviously like reading about cults and everything. I'm not a cult, but, this is a shirt that I made to kind of, it takes some inspiration from the Heaven's Gate. It has the purple sheets. It has the bunk beds. It has, a men or a guy, a woman, and a child there for, this. That just signifies that this podcast is for everyone. Men, women, and children can listen to this podcast. The chick's holding a phone. The kid's holding a microphone because that's, I talk into a microphone. The phone is my logo. And the guy is holding a Kool-Aid with a martini glass, and it says, "Take a sip, you'll love it." Obviously, the Heaven's Gate shit, I just told you people mixed up pudding and poison, but that looks stupid on a t-shirt, so I used the Jonestown Kool-Aid. And I have a little kid saying, "Just do it. Take a sip, you'll love it." That means just like, try the podcast. You'll love the podcast if you give it a chance and you listen, you will love it. And the little kid right there saying, "Just do it," is just paying homage to Nike. But I was interested to learn about all this shit. I didn't know too much about it. I didn't know the details. I just knew some of the details. I didn't know any specifics, but it was interesting to read about. Super dark. I'm definitely not going to do nothing dark next week. I'd love to do something a little bit more light. So if anyone had any good topics they would like me to research, I'm trying to deep dive into this. I probably spend a good 6 hours researching, listening to stuff, reading stuff, looking at stuff, and I'm just trying to do something different with the podcast. I hope people are enjoying what I'm doing because, I'm having fun with it. And I just want to keep providing content with people until I can get back up to the regularly scheduled programming, interviewing people doing dope shit in the city. But until then, I'm down to start doing some different topics. So, I got an email. I'll call you right back at gmail.com. Give me some feedback about what you like about the podcast, what you dislike about the podcast. If you got a topic you'd want me to talk to, you could email me or you could DM me at I'll Call You Right Back on Instagram. And I will appreciate any feedback that I will get. Again, if you have a second, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It means a lot to me, and I'm excited to keep these going until this fucking virus shit kind of simmers down. So wash your ass, wash your hands, check in on your grandparents, check in on everyone you love, and just, touch base with them. Use this time to appreciate your loved ones, and use this time to do something different that you're not used to doing. Like, I'm just sitting on my couch all day, so I'm trying to do some different shit. That's why I'm trying to make sourdough bread. That's why I'm trying to cook a little bit differently. I'm just trying to enjoy this free time that I have. So, if you could take a second, subscribe, rate, and review again. That is the biggest thing you could do to help me, and that would mean a lot. But other than that, thanks for listening as usual. I'll call you right back.